everybody. Welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. We are honored to have in studio today with us Chris Stewart, who is a congressman, who represents the southwest part of the state of Utah, clear up into Salt Lake County. And Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
It's an honor.
So the entire impetus to make the phone call to get in touch with you is about some recent legislation that has a big impact on a lot of Utah's public and private lands in the rural part of the state.
Yeah.
This just happened a couple of weeks ago, I would imagine. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, there's a couple things I hope we'll talk about. One of it is suicide prevention hotline, which has enormous impacts on the rural parts of our state as well. But I think what you're talking about is legislation that we included in the Farm Bill last week. Again, very important to rural Utah. And when you look at my district, I have a really eclectic district. I have downtown Salt Lake City, the avenues, the university, but then it's west and south all the way to St. George. So some very rural parts of the state are in my district, and we proudly represent them. Some of the most beautiful places in the country, I'd say in the world, are in the 2nd district. But turns out the federal government is a big part of people's lives because so much of these districts are controlled by the federal government. And the legislation that we're talking about now is a legislation that deals with the problem that's been growing here, and that is the pinyon juniper, which is an invasive species that comes in and it takes over habitat for sage grouse and for mule deer. It also becomes an enormous fire hazard, as I know that you know. It creates an environment where raptors, which can be predatory, also thrive, but some of the sage grouse don't. So it allows the federal government, it streamlines the environmental process, allows the federal government, particularly the BLM, to be much more aggressive in trying to remove some of this pinyon juniper. And it's something we've been working on, Chad, for a long time. Finally got it over the finish line.
And that's good, because on a regulatory side, it's been a little bit of a nightmare. We've covered the issue several times.
Yeah.
Was the BLM happy to see this? Are they wanting to do more of this?
For sure, including the state BLM and now the federal BLM. Now, my former chief of staff, Dr. Brian Steed, who's a terrific chief for me, is over as the acting director of the BLM. He understands this issue. He understands the West. He understands the frustration of paperwork and red tape. And he knows that from an environmental perspective, this is a very positive thing to do. But there are some activist groups, some environmental groups who oppose it. They have a lot of power, a lot of money, they're very active, and they've made it difficult. We've been trying to do this for several years. The environmental positive nature and the positive outcome of this is almost irrefutable. And whether you're, again, for sage grouse or for mule deer or for other species, this is an easy one. And like I say, we finally have cleared away the path where the BLM could be much more aggressive in doing this.
You know, I find it so interesting that some of these extreme environmental groups that fight this claim to be groups for biodiversity.
Yeah.
And yet they're trying to protect a monoculture, because once the pinyon juniper take over, nothing grows where the juniper, or nothing goes, whatever.
Other than that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so all the understory disappears, and we've seen it. We've taken people out on range tours on our program, and we've seen it directly. So how does this streamline the process, and does it take that ability for, in the environmental process, to cut down on the constant litigation that happens?
Yeah, the litigation is something that we have to deal with separately, because the fact is you can always sue. Now, you might sue and lose, but many times they don't care if they lose. They just want to stop the process. And I'll give you an example. Before I came to Congress, I owned an environmental firm that we would help people on federal lands, and we'd have people come and file to take down some of the deadwood. Particularly after a fire, for a few years that wood has some value. And some groups would immediately sue, and as soon as they did that, the firm would withdraw their permit, knowing that it was going to take longer to fight it. Even though they might win, it would take longer to fight it than the wood would last, and it would be, worth nothing 3 or 4 years later. And many times that's their objective. It isn't to necessarily win in court, it's just to delay and to gum up the process, hoping that the other party will just throw up their hands and say it's too hard, it's too expensive. So that's an issue that will continue, and this mitigates it a little bit. But primarily what it does, it allows for categorical exclusion. It allows for the BLM and in a few cases other government agencies to say broadly, we've already studied this issue. We know the environmental impacts of this issue. We know the environmental outcomes of this issue, and it allows it to go forward much more quickly rather than going through very deep and detailed environmental studies again and again and again and again when they already know what the study is going to conclude.
It's like preventing insanity. Prevents them from doing the same thing over and over again with the same result. Or...
One would hope, but we're talking about Congress and the federal government, so I'm not going to go that far because there's plenty of insanity to go around. But it hopefully minimizes some of it.
How do the mule deer benefit from this? Obviously, if you get the pinyon juniper out, you get a reintroduction of sage grouse, which strangely enough also need lots of grass because they use sage grouse for cover, or the sage for cover, but they don't necessarily dine on it.
Right.
How does it help the deer in this process?
Well, it's just a better habitat for them. Like you said, the pinyon juniper cut down on the natural feed, the natural grasses that would otherwise develop. They provide some cover, but they don't provide ideal cover, and they end up taking up a lot of water. The sportsmen love this legislation. I heard from dozens of them over the weekend, sportsmen here in Utah and the leaders of some sportsmen's groups. In fact, the very first people who reached out after we passed this legislation were the sports groups, because they know this is a real positive thing for them. If you love to hunt, if you want to manage healthy deer herds or elk, this is a very positive thing for that.
Does this also, this does help ranchers as well, does it?
Yeah, it does. Once again, it's kind of a win-win-win situation. And it helps the aesthetics as well. So you've got mule deer, sage grouse, you got other sportsmen, you have a better environment for grasses and for water conservation, and it just looks better. You can go out and see these green meadows that just look healthier than that dry pinyon that sometimes we're seeing everywhere that didn't used to be everywhere.
Excellent. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll talk about suicide prevention in rural Utah and some of the things done at the national level to try and move that along. We'll be right back with the county seat. We're folks bound by traditions. Whether it's holiday time or vacation time, make sure that one of your traditions is a stop at the Creamery in Beaver, Utah. Delicious cheese direct from the factory, ice cream, tasty treats, crafts, and gifts of all kinds. And it's the perfect place to get a bowl of creamy mac and cheese. Start your new tradition the next time you're headed our way. The Creamery in Beaver, Utah. Farm, meet table.
The Utah Farm Bureau began as a collection of farmers supporting each other to raise the food we enjoy. Today, Farm Bureau membership encompasses everyone, whether ranchers, growers, or just everyday folks like you and me. Members enjoy discounts on items like vehicles and ATVs, or insurance that's very affordable. You don't have to be a farmer to join, and dues are small, but together we make a big difference in keeping our food supply local and abundant. Join Utah Farm Bureau.
Crisp, colorful, a world in transition. You don't have to travel the back roads of Maine to explore autumn in all of its glory. Beaver County offers fall in unique splendor, with drives along forgotten canyons and hikes through meadows exploding with vibrant hues of red and yellow. Hit the road with your family and discover a side of Beaver County you never knew you were missing. Autumn is fleeting, so don't hesitate. Beaver County, it's time to experience the real Utah. This is what adventure looks like, and here's what it sounds like. Southwest Utah's Iron County offers some of the most iconic trails within the state that include 200 miles of new trails to be discovered. Check out ironcounty.net for info and interactive maps for your complete guide to off-roading. Explore countless miles of trails in the heart of Dixie National Forest, the gateway to Utah National Parks, Iron County.
Welcome back to the county seat. We're talking with Congressman Chris Stewart. Today we've covered a piece of recent legislation so far that has to deal with land habitat and rehabilitation of land habitat on federal land. Now I want to turn our attention to an outlier of an opioid problem and a mental health problem that extends across the state, particularly in rural Utah. Let's talk about suicide prevention.
Yeah, let's do. And by the way, the good news is we are talking about that. You know, I was talking to someone earlier and made this point. If I were in a group of 100 people 5 years ago and said, how many of you have been touched by suicide in your family or with people that you love? Maybe a few of them would raise their hand. If I had that same group of 100 people, the same people, and asked that question today, many of them would. And the reason being is we're more open to talk about it. We're more willing to recognize this is a problem. It's a problem here in Utah. This isn't just a problem somewhere else. It's a deep problem here in Utah. It's a problem among our veterans, and it's a problem in our rural communities. And we want to try to help that. The good news is, are there things that we can do to help? People who are so discouraged, so despairing, that they're really contemplating taking their own life, if they can talk to the right person, if they can get help, many, many times we can help that person. We can give them what they need in order to get them in a better place where they can go on and be happy and live a happy and fulfilling life. But we have to be able to reach them at that critical moment. That's what this legislation does. It makes it much easier for those people who really need help, whether you live in rural Utah or in New York City. It allows people who really need help to get that help and to do it very quickly.
What are the mechanics of it? How is this going to help Loa, Utah?
Yeah, it's really pretty simple. If you go to Loa or St. George or Salt Lake City, and if you ask people, if you or someone you know is contemplating suicide, who would you call? Most people would say, I don't know, I guess I'd Google suicide prevention. And the thing is there's a 1-800 number, but no one knows what it is. And our answer is no, the number is probably 611. It might be 211 or 411, but it's a 3-digit number. So the people know, just like when you have an emergency, you call 911. If you have a mental health emergency, you call 611. And people will remember that. And in that real critical moment when you're not thinking clearly or someone you love isn't thinking clearly, that's not the time for them to be going, gosh, I wish I knew what that number was. 611, they call, and then that routes that call to the local resource. So if you call that here in Salt Lake City, you're going to be, or in Loa, you're going to be routed to Utah's help hotline for that. If you call in another state or another city, you'll be routed to a local resource. People who are trained, people who are compassionate, people who want to help and are able to help in those situations.
So this, in a way, is a broader application of 911, which I think almost all states now use as an emergency response, and then it goes from that local exchange to local law enforcement. So in Loa, they'd be dispatched to Richfield, because that's where their 6-county mental health is. Yeah. Salt Lake, they'd go to some connection of the mental health.
And in some cases, that local facility may be busy or not have a resource available, then it would automatically relate to the next closest, probably here to Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City, we do such a great job on that. Utah, I should say, it's not just the city, it's a Utah resource. We do such a good job that we have referrals from all over the country that come here because we're very effective at it. And we're able to provide an intermediate step that some states are not able to do. But your point, Chad, as you were saying, it's to a resource that's close, that understands, and they're able to reach out and give you some of that support you may be needing.
Has this been tried anywhere else?
No, at least not that I'm aware of. Certainly not here in our country, because that's why this is a national suicide prevention hotline. It's not a state suicide prevention. It's a national effort. And the reason being is that there just isn't anything like it here in the United States.
Do you have high hopes for it?
Oh, absolutely. For a number of reasons. This is a good actual civics lesson, if you will, and I'm diverting for just a minute, but look, this is bipartisan, it doesn't cost anything, and who's objecting to this? And yet, still, it took us 3 years to get this through Congress. You want to go beat your head against the wall sometimes because it shouldn't take that long. But the good news is once again, it's bipartisan, it's not controversial, it's not expensive, and we've got a broad coalition, and from veterans groups who, by the way, are, as a veteran myself, and as someone who comes from a family of veterans, I understand that they have particular needs sometimes. So, no, we're very optimistic. We think that this will be implemented probably in the first quarter or so of 2019.
So I want to take just a minute before we go to our next break and talk about Washington, because we're...
Now, why would you want to ruin this whole thing by talking Washington?
We are at the end of the year, and things are going to change in Congress when you head back. How is Utah going to navigate in that, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, we will, because we always have. You know, we've had changes in the House, changes in the Senate, changes in the White House, and it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of democracy, although sometimes we feel like it is. And sometimes we have reason to feel like it. So we will get through it, but I'll tell you that my job is much less satisfying, because it's going to be very, very difficult for me to do the things that I think are our priorities. And it's going to be, look, I sit on two very powerful committees. Some of the most powerful committees in Congress, the Appropriations Committee, and I'm optimistic on that. We have great relationships on both sides of the aisle. We worked with them, Democrats, on their priorities, and we expect they're going to work with us, and we're going to have some bipartisan, I think, support and some good outcomes in appropriations. A good example of that is the problem we've had with horses, wild horses. That's a bipartisan effort on that. The other committee I sit on, the Intel Committee or Intelligence Committee, it's going to be hard. I mean, the incoming chairman is a very partisan person. He wants nothing more than to investigate and to embarrass and to eventually impeach our president. And it's going to be a bit of a struggle on that committee. And speaking, Chad, broadly about Congress, you know, we've got 2 years where the Democrats are going to set the priorities, but we still need to fund the government. There's still important legislation that needs to move forward, and I'm hopeful that we'll find a way to do some of that.
Is there's majority a legislative proof majority that they've gained on the other party?
Well, no, not in this sense, and that is they'll be able to pass their priorities through the House, but they won't get it through a Republican Senate. And unless they can work in a bipartisan fashion, they're not going to get the Senate to approve, or the president would end up vetoing it. So hopefully it brings the Democrats to a position where they go, if we're going to do anything, we have to do something in a bipartisan way. And by the way, if they don't, they'll pay a real price in 2020. Because the American people, they may not like Donald Trump, some of them, but you can't disagree that he's been successful in implementing some important policies, whether it's tax reform or environmental issues, as we've talked about, whether it's defeating ISIS, whether it's rebuilding our military, whether it's Justice Gorsuch and other justices on the Supreme and other important courts. The president has been successful. He can go to the American people and say, look what I've done. The Democrats need to be able to do that in 2020. And the only way they'll be able to is if they can find ways that we can work together.
Excellent. We're going to take a quick break. I have some intelligence questions for you, and it's not an IQ test of me. We'll be right back with the county seat.
In a place that is beyond words, there is nothing to be said, except take your time in Bryce Canyon country.
Welcome back to the county seat, talking to Congressman Chris Stewart, who's been so kind to spend some time and some insight with us in the studio today. Intelligence. This is a very important area, and this has been an area that you've been very active in. Are you concerned that with the change in priority that there's some things on the table that we should be paying attention to that we're not going to, and what are they?
Oh yeah, I am actually a little bit, although before I go too far on that, I'll be fair and say let's wait and see. But there are certain priorities that the Intelligence Committee on the House and Senate have to do. There are some places that I have to go and approve some things, and if we don't do that, those activities have to cease. And I think my Democratic colleagues on the Intelligence Committee recognize that and will honor that. I hope that they will. The work is too important. But the thing that concerns me is when you listen to them and what they've said since the election, they've talked about none of that. They've expressed no interest in talking or pursuing those important priorities for American people. It's always been, as I said, it's been about investigating the president. The good news is on this, and I'm not being Pollyannish, I really believe that. National security and our intelligence operations are so important that at the end of the day, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, they recognize that. I think they'll give it the attention that they know it needs. Well, it's the most important thing that we do. I mean, the fundamental responsibility of the federal government is to keep us safe. If they fail in that, what else matters? And again, I think that most people in Congress remember that.
So how does this all play into the border? Because that seems to also take all the oxygen out of the room when you bring it up.
Well, it does. And by the way, two things on that. One is the president has done this as well. I don't think we need to refer to it as the wall, because it's not going to be a wall. No one is suggesting we actually build a 2,000-mile wall. It's border security. And if you want to know what it looks like, go to Israel and look at what they've done very effectively and how it's an incredible reduction in terrorist activity once they put up their version of the wall or border security. It's sensors, it's areas that are observed, it's drones in some cases it's actually a wall or a fence. Anyone who suggests that that's a bad idea, I just don't get them. How can you not realize that every nation has a responsibility and a right to protect itself, to protect their own borders?
Wouldn't there be some people who would call you nationalist for saying that, saying that your borders are important?
If the definition of a nationalist is that, then I am. But for heaven's sakes, they use it in a derogatory way, and they actually bastardize the definition of it in many ways, and it's unfair because it's just a way to demean people. But if you think that putting America's interest is the job of American leadership, then that's what we're trying to do. And it's been too politicized, there's no doubt about it, and it's particularly of late. A couple of years ago, the Democrats all supported this idea of border security, and they backed off of that. And again, it's politics that's driven then backward, it hasn't the policy. I hope we resolve that in the next few days.
That's going to resolve a mindset of people that are currently in office, is it not?
Well, one would hope, in the sense that there would be agreement that this is important, but again, people use this as a political football. My Democratic colleagues use this to motivate an already angry Democratic base, and they want to keep that as an issue. Republicans, such as myself, are driven by this idea that it's incredibly important to us and our constituents and to the president. And those two principles have come in conflict for a while now.
Well, I don't want to go too far without another break because we've got to feed the beast. So we'll be right back with our final comments with Congressman Chris Stewart in just a minute here on the county seat.
What would you do with an extra day in Utah Valley? Explore the Wasatch Mountains? Snap a family photo at Bridal Veil Falls. Cool off on Utah Lake or the Provo River. No matter what you're searching for, you can find it in Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
All local products have a story of magical places, real people, and delicious recipes spanning generations. So go ahead and discover. flavors you've never tasted, and friends you never knew you had. Utah's own. Discover local food.
There's a little place on a Utah map where I was raised, where my heart's at, where the sagebrush grows wild and high, and the stars come out at night. Oh, there ain't nothing like being raised in the basin with a Ute reservation, skiing starvation, that Duchesne County life.
149 million years in the making, dinosaurs once roamed this land. Now they're found at the Dinosaur National Monument. Let's take you beyond the bones. We call it Dinosaur Land. You'll find it offers adventures and sights not seen anywhere else in the world. Come to Dinosaur Land, Vernal, Utah. You'll want to stay forever. The dinosaurs did.
Welcome back to the county seat. A really good conversation today with Congressman Chris Stewart. And I do have a final question for you. We've got a couple minutes left. And you've been really good at telling us all the stuff that we've asked. So what can constituents do to help you do your job the next 2 years?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. I think I would say maybe two things, maybe three, we'll see. The first thing is I talk to too many people who have really lost hope. They feel like it's the end of the world, and I don't mean just because of an election. I'm talking about this time in general. And by the way, a lot of Democrats feel that way. They feel like Donald Trump is the end of time. It's the end of humanity. It's the end of freedom and democracy. And it turns out that's probably not true. A lot of Republicans are feeling the same way, although for very different reasons. And so the first thing I would ask us as Americans is to recognize we've been through tough times before. I mean, my heavens, we got through the Civil War. We got through the miracle of the creation of the Constitution when some of those founding fathers fought immediately after that. We've been through the Great Depression. We've been through the Cold War. We can find a way to get through this. So I would ask people, don't lose hope. Don't despair. Have faith in one another. Have faith in our country. And the second thing I would ask, and this one's harder, and I say it a bit reluctantly, but it's true, and that is we need to have a little bit of patience. We can't fix every problem overnight. I think this president has done a remarkable job in addressing meaningful problems, as I have listed here. But even he has learned you don't fix them with the stroke of a pen. You don't fix them on one weekend. It takes a little bit of time. That's the way our founding fathers set it up. God bless them for doing that. It allows us to do it in a reasonable manner. But sometimes we have to remind ourselves, you got to be a little bit patient. You got to keep working. Don't despair and don't get discouraged. If we do that, then we'll work our way through this. We'll be okay.
Excellent. Boy, you are a right-on-time guy. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Congressman, appreciate it. Come back anytime. We want to thank you for tuning into the county seat each week. Remember, local government and involvement in government is where your life really takes place. So be involved, be part of the solution, and we will see you next week on the county seat.